Great, well, I'll get started. So hi, everyone. Thank you for having me today. My name is Grace, and I'm a policy analyst at Tech Against Terrorism. And today I'll be doing a 15-minute lightning talk on our work in supporting the global tech sector in building a human rights safeguarding online counterterrorism approach. So for those of you who aren't familiar with our work, Tech Against Terrorism is a public-private partnership focused on knowledge sharing and providing support to smaller tech platforms in tackling terrorist exploitation of the internet, whilst importantly upholding human rights. And we work with a broad range of stakeholders, from industry-led initiatives to governments and academia, as well as civil society. And we also work closely with the Global Internet Forum to Counterterrorism to provide mentorship to tech companies. So our work at Tech Against Terrorism consists of three core work streams. The first is our analysis of the threat and outreach. So this is composed of our open source intelligence analysis and our original research into terrorist and violent extremist exploitation of the internet. The second is knowledge sharing and best practice, which is the work stream we'll be focusing on today. And through this, we facilitate inter-industry and cross-sector support mechanisms through our online tools, guides, and practical data sets, such as the knowledge sharing platform and our mentorship program. And finally, we also provide technical supports and resources to tech companies to improve their counterterrorism mechanisms. So an example of this is our terrorist content analytics platform, which alerts platforms to branded content associated with designated terrorist organizations. So as part of that second knowledge sharing and best practice work stream, the policy advisory and response team work closely in supporting tech companies with their counterterrorism, content moderation, and human rights policies. So we do this namely through bespoke policy consultancy and our mentorship program. So launched in 2018, our mentorship program is a capacity building program which aims to give practical policy advice and support to tech platforms in building their counterterrorism approach policies, whilst ensuring that the safeguarding of human rights and freedom of expression is kept at the core of our work. Our mentorship program also supports tech platforms in strengthening transparency and accountability mechanisms around online counterterrorism and moderation, which is critical for safeguarding human rights, which I'll get to later. So as of November 2022, Tech Against Terrorism has mentored 41 tech platforms, and these are representative of the broader tech ecosystem. So from the smaller tech platforms run by a single person to larger tech platforms, and they represent a diverse range of online spaces. So from social media and video sharing services to sharing economy platforms. And every mentee has their own content moderation approach and faces different unique threats in terms of how terrorist and violent extremist actors attempt to exploit their services. And you can see some of the examples of the support we provide to tech platforms on the screen here. So looking more in depth at the capacity building elements of our mentorship program, we focus on three key avenues of support. So firstly, content standards and respect for rights. So we support in improving community guidelines and developing content moderation best practice, future-proofing policies and processes to stay ahead of the evolving threat, and guidance on operationalizable definitions of terrorism and violent extremism. Secondly is terrorist content identification and takedown. So we support in improving tech platforms' understanding of the terrorist and violent extremist threat landscape. We alert when terrorist and violent extremist content is located on a platform, namely through our terrorist content analytics platform, and we provide policy advice adapted to the threat faced by each platform. And lastly, we also provide transparency support, so we promote improved and proportionate tech sector transparency and accountability. We provide practical support in producing transparency reports, and we also advocate for accountability and transparency beyond reporting, so through a clear and detailed counter-terrorist and violent extremist approach. And we do all of this through direct and bespoke policy consultancy within our mentorship program with tech platforms, as well as sharing research and resources such as our knowledge sharing platform, which I'll get to later. So our mentorship program is underpinned by the four key principles that you can see here. So firstly, human rights and freedom of expression, which is the focus of the talk today. And we safeguard these principles by implementing human rights compliant processes in line with the Tech Against Terrorism pledge, which I'll speak more on later. The rule of law, which is ensuring that content moderation is inscribed in the rule of law, which facilitates safeguarding of human rights. Transparency, which is vital to ensuring accountability towards the public and internet users, and providing insight into what extent human rights and fundamental freedoms are respected across the internet. And lastly, tech platform autonomy. So our recommendations are made on an advisory basis and are tailored to each platform's specificities. So we make sure to keep these guiding principles at the core of our policy advice and support for tech platforms throughout the mentorship programme. Before diving in more depth as to how we actively safeguard human rights in our mentorship work, I thought I would speak a little bit about human rights and countering terrorist use of the internet and why this is so important. So in this space, there's lots of work done and lots spoken about human rights and counterterrorism or human rights and content moderation, but there's comparably less consideration towards the intersection of the three. So Tech Against Terrorism focuses on mitigating how counterterrorism and content moderation online does not infringe on human rights, which is the section in the middle of the Venn diagram there. So human rights equally apply online and should be as protected as they are offline. Human rights are often translated into the online space through the lens of digital rights. So a baseline of rights to be protected when exercised online, often focusing on freedom of expression and access to information. Multiple rights, both online and offline, are at risk of infringement in relation to platforms' counterterrorism and content moderation activities. So the rights to freedom of expression and access to information are the most at risk of infringement due to content removal. The risk to political participation could be infringed, as the line between terrorist content and legitimate political speech is often tenuous, and the right to privacy is also at high risk due to increased government pressure for platforms to monitor all online interactions for counterterrorism reasons. Discussions around online counterterrorism efforts' impact on human rights should not be limited to digital rights, but should be considered in how human rights online and offline are intertwined. And increasingly, international human rights standards and experts increasingly recognize private businesses' responsibility towards protecting these rights and mitigating against the negative impact of their operations. The UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights establish the standards by which private corporations should abide by in respecting human rights. And policymakers, rights advocates, and public opinion are increasingly demanding online service providers to acknowledge human rights responsibilities. So how does Tech Against Terrorism in practice support in safeguarding human rights when countering terrorist use of the internet through the mentorship programme? So firstly, we ask all of our mentees to sign our Tech Against Terrorism pledge, and as of November 2022, we currently have 17 platform signatures. So the pledge is our 6 guiding principles which inform our approach and underpin our framework for engaging with all tech companies. And these reinforce the importance of addressing challenging content and supporting tech companies in articulating their commitment to human rights and diversity in a transparent, accountable, and collaborative way. So the pledge provides a simple and accessible guideline to help all companies understand the importance of tackling terrorist exploitation in a manner that respects human rights and freedom of speech. Our pledge also focuses on ensuring that small companies who often do not have the resources to familiarise themselves with the myriad of legal regimes and social contexts which may apply to their services, make sure that they can contribute to a free internet. And it acts as a starting point from which companies can build their own appropriate systems and policies. And our pledge is based on various principles and international recognized norms, such as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and various UN Security Council resolutions, documents, and guiding principles. So the pledge is a commitment to 6 key areas, which is freedom of expression, non-discrimination and diversity, privacy, transparency and accountability, remedy, and collaboration. So next, we give all mentees access to our knowledge sharing platform, which is a collection of interactive tools and resources designed to support tech companies in their operational and policy-oriented efforts with regards to developing and implementing an effective and human rights compliant counterterrorism response. As part of this knowledge sharing platform, we have a human rights standards table, which provides an overview of human rights principles, which are applicable to online space and tech platforms directly. Every one of our mentees also undergoes a policy review in which we assess a tech platform's human rights compliance as one of the key areas of importance, and we provide recommendations on how to better this. And we also offer more in-depth human rights assessments on counterterrorism and offer practical recommendations there for tech platforms' human rights policies and approach. So some of the key considerations we recommend platforms to consider when thinking about the human rights impact of countering terrorism and violent extremism online can be split into policy and enforcement. So on the policy side, platforms should consider publishing a commitment to countering terrorist and violent extremist use of their services, detailing the key actions taken in response to terrorist and violent extremist use of the service. So this should include a commitment to safeguarding human rights when engaging in online counterterrorism. We also recommend platforms to consider publishing a counterterrorism policy, laying out the internal processes in place to detect, review, and action terrorist and violent extremist content, and how human rights considerations are integrated into the platform's counterterrorism efforts. We recommend platforms to refer to national and international designation lists when prohibiting terrorist and violent extremist actors to ensure that prohibitions are based in the rule of law. And this reference to those designation lists should be included in the public prohibition of terrorism and violent extremism. We recommend platforms to increase transparency around collaboration with third-party experts if involved in providing feedback on counterterrorism policy and response. And we also recommend making public within the community guidelines or other counterterrorism and violent extremism related policy documents exceptions to the terrorism and violent extremist prohibition. So allowing for journalistic reporting and legitimate discussions or criticisms around terrorist and violent extremist activities. On enforcement, Tech Against Terrorism recommends strengthening moderation processes, so in particular the review of terrorist and violent extremist content to ensure that content removal is based on international human rights standards. You can do this through more regular human rights training for the enforcement team, training resources dedicated to the counterterrorism's impact on human rights, and ensuring a regular review of these resources to reflect the fast-changing threat landscape, and an assessment framework for content removal based on international human rights standards. We also recommend ensuring that the development or purchase of automated moderation tools consider the risk of human rights impacts and include the necessary safeguards. And we recommend creating a specific review process for high-level counterterrorism decisions that could have a critical impact on human rights, so in particular on users' freedom of expression and political opinion. And lastly, we recommend publishing a review of erroneous counterterrorism decisions that have had a significant impact on human rights, and detailing in this review how these lessons learned have informed policy development and enforcement going forward. So another key component of our work on human rights is through supporting transparency and accountability. So moderation of terrorist content online at scale is never going to be perfect, and it will lead to human rights infringements. Platforms, people, and machines will inevitably make mistakes. We need processes and safeguards in place to mitigate against these mistakes, and the most critical of these is transparency and accountability. So knowing what platforms are doing, what mistakes have been made, and how we can appeal against these mistakes, whether that be through user appeals, clear community guidelines, or making it clear what your platform considers to be a terrorist group. We have to ensure that tech companies do not overstep, and transparency is the only accountability mechanism to ensure that they do not do so. Transparency reporting provides insight into what extent freedom of expression and the right to privacy are respected across the internet. It can encourage and recognize meaningful action from tech companies in tackling terrorist use of the internet, and it also provides crucial insights into the threat landscape and can create an evidence base over time to better inform online regulation. And if you're a tech company, it reinforces company values while easing concerns for users' privacies, and it raises awareness of the extent of government requests for content takedown, making it easier to hold governments accountable. And it contributes to the wider debate on how content can be regulated without solely resorting to removal. And that's why transparency is a core part of Tech Against Terrorism's work for the tech sector, including in the mentorship program, in which we offer transparency report, support, and reviews. So we also advocate for transparency, not just from tech companies, but also from the government. So for example, currently only Europol and New Zealand have dedicated transparency reports on online counterterrorism efforts. So with this in mind, Tech Against Terrorism has created transparency reporting guidelines, which you can see a link to on the screen, for tech companies and governments to improve transparency and accountability in counterterrorism efforts across the tech sector. Our guidelines include baseline metrics to include key transparency considerations and how to provide meaningful transparency, as well as example reports that can be used. So hopefully you found that a helpful high-level overview of our work on countering terrorist use of the internet while safeguarding human rights. And if you have any questions at all or you're interested in our mentorship program, then please reach out to my email on the screen, and thank you for your time.